What if everything you've been told about human evolution is a carefully constructed lie? What if the missing link isn't missing at all, but deliberately hidden? And what if the most profound question isn't where we came from, but who created us and why? Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial theories ever proposed about human origins. A theory that suggests our DNA wasn't shaped by millions of years of random mutations and natural selection, but was deliberately programmed by an advanced extraterrestrial species known as the Anunnaki. Not as companions, not as children, but as a genetically engineered labor force designed to serve their needs. I'm talking about a conspiracy so vast, so fundamentally challenging to everything we think we know about ourselves, that it would rewrite every history book, every religious text, every scientific paper ever written about human evolution. And the evidence, when you start looking for it, is hiding in plain sight. Now, let me paint you a picture of what we're really dealing with here. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA. That's 3 billion letters in the code that makes you, you. To put that in perspective, if you were to print out the human genome, it would fill about 1,000 books, each with 1,000 pages. That's not just complex, that's impossibly, almost incomprehensibly complex. Yet mainstream science wants us to believe that this intricate biological programming arose through completely random processes over millions of years. Random mutations, they say. Natural selection, they claim. But here's what they don't want you to think too carefully about. The mathematical probability of even a single functional protein forming by chance is so astronomically small that it's essentially zero. We're talking about odds of 1 in 10 to the power of 164. To give you context, there are only 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the entire observable universe. So how did we get here? How did beings capable of contemplating their own existence, of creating art and music and philosophy, of reaching for the stars themselves, emerge from primordial soup through nothing but random chance? The answer, according to ancient Sumerian texts that predate every major religion on Earth, is that we didn't. The Anunnaki, described in cuneiform tablets that are older than the Bible, older than the Torah, older than any religious text you can name, tell a very different story about human origins. These aren't metaphorical creation myths or symbolic parables. These are detailed historical accounts, complete with names, dates, locations, and most importantly, specific descriptions of genetic engineering techniques that sound remarkably similar to what we're only now beginning to understand in our modern laboratories. The word, Anunnaki itself, means those who from heaven to earth came. Not gods in the supernatural sense, but beings from another world who possessed technology so advanced that to primitive humans, they might as well have been divine. And according to these ancient texts, they didn't come here as explorers or teachers. They came here as miners, seeking gold to repair the damaged atmosphere of their dying home world. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really unsettling. The Anunnaki, these advanced beings with their sophisticated technology, didn't want to do the dangerous, back-breaking work of mining themselves. They needed workers. They needed a labor force. But the primitive hominids already living on Earth weren't intelligent enough or physically capable enough for the complex tasks required. So they did something that, until very recently in human history, would have been considered pure fantasy. They genetically modified the existing hominid species, splicing their own DNA with that of early humans to create a hybrid workforce. A species intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, strong enough to perform heavy labor, but not so advanced that they would question their role or rebel against their creators. The Sumerian tablets describe this process in remarkable detail. They speak of Enki, the Anunnaki scientist responsible for the genetic modifications, working in what they called the House of Creation. They describe the mixing of clay, which scholars now interpret as genetic material, with the essence of the Anunnaki themselves. They even provide what appears to be a step-by-step account of the genetic engineering process, including multiple attempts and refinements to create the perfect worker. But here's what makes this theory so compelling and so terrifying. When you start looking at human DNA through the lens of genetic engineering rather than random evolution, patterns emerge that mainstream science struggles to explain. Patterns that make perfect sense if we were designed rather than evolved. Let's start with something called junk DNA. For decades, scientists dismissed the vast portions of human genetic code that didn't seem to serve any obvious function. They called it evolutionary baggage, leftover remnants from our supposed evolutionary past. But as our understanding of genetics has advanced, we've discovered that this so-called junk DNA actually contains incredibly complex regulatory systems, switches and controls that manage how our genes are expressed. More intriguingly, much of this regulatory DNA appears to be what geneticists call compressed information. It's as if someone took a massive amount of data and found ways to pack it into the smallest possible space, like a master programmer optimizing code for efficiency. This isn't what you'd expect from random evolutionary processes, which tend to be messy and inefficient. This looks like the work of an intelligent designer working within specific constraints. Then there's the issue of human chromosome 2. Every other primate species has 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have only 23. According to evolutionary theory, this should represent a massive genetic catastrophe. Losing an entire chromosome should be fatal, or at least severely debilitating. Instead, human chromosome 2 appears to be the result of two smaller chromosomes being deliberately fused together, with telomeric sequences found in the middle of the chromosome where the fusion occurred. It's as if someone took two separate programs and merged them into one more efficient system. But the most compelling evidence comes from what geneticists call orphan genes. These are genes that appear in human DNA but have no evolutionary precursors in any other species on Earth. According to standard evolutionary theory, every gene should have a traceable lineage back through earlier species. But orphan genes just appear fully formed and functional, as if they were inserted from an outside source. Recent studies have identified hundreds of these orphan genes in human DNA, and many of them control uniquely human characteristics. The ability to process complex language, advanced reasoning capabilities, the capacity for abstract thought. These aren't gradual evolutionary improvements. These are quantum leaps in capability that appeared suddenly in the genetic record, with no apparent precursors. What's even more fascinating is that many of these orphan genes show signs of what geneticists call codon optimization. This is a technique used in modern genetic engineering to modify genes from one species so they'll function properly in another species. The genetic code itself is universal, but different species have preferences for which version of each amino acid they use. When you're transferring genes between species, you have to optimize the codon usage for the host species, or the genes won't function properly. The fact that human orphan genes show signs of codon optimization suggests they were indeed transferred from another species, and that whoever did the transferring knew enough about genetics to optimize the code for human biology. This isn't something that happens naturally through evolution. This is the signature of intelligent genetic engineering. And then there are the regulatory sequences, the parts of DNA that control when and how genes are activated. In naturally evolved organisms, these regulatory sequences tend to be relatively simple and straightforward. But human regulatory DNA contains incredibly complex nested hierarchies of control systems, feedback loops, and error correction mechanisms that look remarkably similar to the kinds of control systems you'd find in sophisticated computer programs. It's as if our DNA contains not just the instructions for building a human body, but also the equivalent of an operating system to run it, complete with security protocols, error handling, and upgrade pathways. This level of sophistication in biological programming is something we're only just beginning to achieve in our most advanced genetic engineering projects. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of human genetics from the Anunnaki theory perspective is what appears to be built-in limitations and dependencies. Unlike other species, humans are remarkably poorly adapted to survive without technology and social organization. We can't survive in most natural environments without tools, clothing, and shelter. We require cooked food to properly digest many nutrients. We're born helpless and require years of intensive care to reach maturity. From an evolutionary standpoint, these characteristics make no sense. Natural selection should favor self-sufficiency and environmental adaptation. But from a genetic engineering standpoint, these limitations make perfect sense. If you're creating a labor force, you want them dependent on the civilization and technology you provide. You want them to require the systems you've built rather than being able to survive independently in the wild. The ancient Sumerian texts describe exactly this scenario. They speak of the Anunnaki creating humans who required their guidance, their technology, their social structures to survive and thrive. The texts describe how the Anunnaki taught humans agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, and mathematics, not out of benevolence, but because these skills were necessary for humans to perform their intended functions as a labor force. And here's where the story becomes even more intriguing. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki didn't just create one type of human. They created multiple variants, each designed for specific purposes. Some were bred for physical labor in the mines. Others were designed to be administrators and overseers. Still, others were created to serve as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and the worker populations. This multi-tiered approach to human creation might explain some of the puzzling aspects of human genetic diversity. Why do some populations show dramatically different physical and cognitive characteristics despite supposedly sharing recent common ancestors? Why do intelligence, physical capabilities, and even disease susceptibilities vary so significantly between different human populations? The mainstream explanation relies on relatively recent evolutionary pressures and genetic drift, but the Anunnaki theory suggests these differences might be much older and much more deliberate, reflecting different design parameters for different human variants created to serve different functions in an ancient labor system. The implications of this theory extend far beyond just our understanding of human origins. If the Anunnaki really did genetically engineer humans as a labor force, then we need to ask ourselves some deeply uncomfortable questions about what that means for us today. Are we still serving that original purpose? Are we still, in some fundamental way, programmed to be workers rather than truly free beings? Look around at modern human society. Despite all our technological advances, despite our supposed evolution into sophisticated civilizations, what do we spend most of our lives doing? Working, laboring, serving systems and structures that seem to exist beyond our control or understanding. We wake up, we go to jobs that often feel meaningless, we produce wealth for others, and we return home exhausted, only to repeat the cycle the next day. Is this really the natural state of an evolved species? Or is this the persistent echo of our original programming as a genetically engineered workforce? The ancient tablets describe something called the burden of the gods, the work that the Anunnaki needed done but didn't want to do themselves. Initially, younger Anunnaki were assigned these tasks, but they eventually rebelled, demanding that their elders find another solution. That solution was us. Humans designed specifically to bear the burden that even advanced extraterrestrial beings found undesirable. And here's what's truly chilling about this possibility. If we were indeed created as a labor force, then many of the characteristics we think of as fundamentally human, our drive to work, our tendency to organize into hierarchical societies, our acceptance of authority structures, even our concept of purpose and meaning being tied to productivity, These might not be natural human traits at all. They might be programmed behaviors, genetic imperatives installed by our creators to ensure we would continue serving their purposes long after they departed. Think about how effortlessly humans fall into worker-boss relationships. How naturally we accept that some people give orders and others follow them. How readily we organize ourselves into complex systems of labor and production. Other social species have hierarchies, yes, but nothing approaching the sophisticated, multi-layered labor systems that humans create instinctively. We build civilizations the way bees build hives or ants build colonies, except our constructions are far more complex and far more focused on resource extraction and production. We strip mine entire continents, reshape landscapes, alter the chemistry of our atmosphere, all in service of systems that seem to have taken on lives of their own. Is this really intelligent behavior from a supposedly evolved species? Or is this the persistent execution of ancient programming? The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as having a particular obsession with gold, not for decoration or currency, but for its unique properties in repairing atmospheric damage to their home planet. Modern science has confirmed that gold nanoparticles can, indeed, be used to reflect solar radiation and potentially repair ozone damage. The ancients couldn't have known this through primitive observation alone. But here's the fascinating part. Humans retain an almost irrational obsession with gold even today. We've built entire economic systems around this single metal. We store it in vast underground vaults. We fight wars over it. We structure our monetary systems around it. Why? Gold has very few practical applications for most of human history. It's too soft for tools, too heavy for most construction. Yet we've always valued it above almost everything else. Is this learned behavior, or is it programmed behavior? Are we still, on some genetic level, compelled to mine and hoard gold for masters who may have long since departed? The evidence for ongoing genetic manipulation doesn't end with ancient history. Throughout human civilization, there have been persistent accounts of beings appearing to selected humans, often described as gods, angels, or spirits, who provide knowledge, technology, or genetic material. These encounters often involve what modern researchers call missing time, reproductive interference, or the birth of unusually gifted offspring. Could these be periodic maintenance visits? Updates to the human genetic code to ensure we continue serving our intended purpose as civilizations become more complex? The technology required for such interventions would be far beyond current human capabilities, but well within the reach of the beings who originally created us. Consider how rapidly human technology has advanced in just the past century. We've gone from horse-drawn carriages to space travel, from simple mechanical devices to quantum computers, from basic chemistry to genetic engineering. This rate of advancement is unprecedented in the natural world. Most species remain essentially unchanged for millions of years. Yet humans have transformed themselves and their environment in the blink of an evolutionary eye. This could be evidence of our original programming finally reaching maturity. Perhaps we were designed not just as simple laborers, but as a species capable of technological advancement that would eventually serve our creator's purposes on a galactic scale. Perhaps the rapid acceleration of human technology isn't random progress, but the activation of dormant genetic subroutines programmed into our DNA millions of years ago. The space race, our obsession with reaching other planets, our development of artificial intelligence and robotics, our manipulation of genetic codes, all of these could be the fulfillment of our original design specifications. We might be unconsciously preparing ourselves to serve our creator's needs across multiple worlds, multiple star systems. And if that's the case, then the question becomes, what happens when our creators return to collect on their investment? The ancient texts suggest that the Anunnaki didn't abandon Earth permanently. They describe cyclical returns, periods when the gods would come back to check on their creation, to harvest resources, to make adjustments to human civilization? Many of these cyclical visits correspond to major upheavals in human history, the rise and fall of empires, technological leaps, population bottlenecks that geneticists can't fully explain through natural causes. Are we approaching another such cycle? Are the recent UFO disclosures by government agencies around the world, the sudden acknowledgement of unexplained aerial phenomena, the admission that objects with impossible flight characteristics are operating in our airspace, are these signs that our creators are preparing for another harvest? Look at the timing. Just as human technology reaches the point where we can begin to understand our own genetic code, just as we develop the capability for space travel and planetary colonization, just as we create artificial intelligence that might eventually surpass human capabilities, suddenly governments are admitting that we're not alone in the universe. Is this coincidence? Or is this the beginning of a revelation that will fundamentally change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos? Are we being prepared for reintegration into a galactic civilization that we never knew we were part of? The psychological implications are staggering. If humans discover that we were created as a labor force, that our civilizations, our cultures, our very sense of identity and purpose are all expressions of genetic programming installed by extraterrestrial beings, how do we process that information? How do we maintain any sense of free will or self-determination? Yet there might be hope in this revelation. Understanding our origins, even if they're artificial, could be the first step toward transcending them. If we recognize the programming, we might be able to rewrite it. If we understand the limitations built into our genetic code, we might be able to overcome them. The human capacity for abstract thought, creativity, and spiritual experience might represent elements of our design that go beyond simple labor functionality. Perhaps, in creating us, the Anunnaki inadvertently or intentionally included capabilities that would eventually allow us to evolve beyond our original purpose. The question is whether we're ready to take that step, or whether we'll continue following the ancient programming, building civilizations that serve purposes we don't understand, creating technologies that we hand over to systems beyond our control, living lives that feel meaningful to us but might be nothing more than the execution of someone else's grand design. The answers to these questions aren't just academic. They could determine the future of human consciousness, human freedom, and humanity's ultimate destiny in a universe that might be far more populated, far more structured, and far more purposeful than we ever imagined. The more you examine the archaeological record through this lens, the more unsettling patterns begin to emerge. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which predate Stonehenge by over 6,000 years, show evidence, knowledge that shouldn't have, of construction techniques and astronomical existed among supposedly primitive hunter-gatherer societies. The precision of the stone cutting, the complex astronomical alignments, the sophisticated understanding of engineering required to move and position massive megalithic blocks, all of this suggests access to advanced knowledge that has no clear evolutionary path in human development. But here's what's really fascinating. When you map the locations of these impossible ancient sites, they form patterns. Not random distributions that you'd expect from independent human settlements, but deliberate networks spanning continents. These sites are positioned at specific intervals, often corresponding to geological features like underground water systems, mineral deposits, or areas of unusual electromagnetic activity. It's as if someone was establishing a global infrastructure, positioning facilities at strategic locations for purposes we can barely comprehend. And the timing of these constructions correlates suspiciously with what geneticists call selective sweeps in human DNA, periods when certain genetic variants suddenly became dominant across entire populations without clear evolutionary advantages. Think about what that implies. At the same time that humans were supposedly developing naturally through random mutations and environmental pressures, they were simultaneously constructing megalithic sites that required knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, geology, and engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years. Unless, of course, they weren't discovering this knowledge at all. Unless they were being given it. The ancient Sumerian tablets describe something called the Watchers, Anunnaki, assigned to monitor and guide human development. These beings didn't just create us and abandon us. They maintained an active presence, providing knowledge and technology when it served their purposes, withholding it when humans began to develop beyond their intended parameters. This pattern of guided development explains so many anomalies in human history. Why do we see sudden leaps in capability, followed by mysterious collapses? Why do advanced civilizations seem to appear fully formed, then disappear, leaving only massive stone monuments that later humans couldn't replicate? Why does human progress seem to follow cycles of advancement and regression rather than steady evolutionary improvement? The answer might be that we've never been in control of our own development. We've been managed, guided, occasionally reset when we strayed too far from our intended path. The Great Floods described in cultures around the world, the sudden disappearances of advanced civilizations, even the mysterious population bottlenecks that geneticists detect in human history. These might not be natural disasters at all. They might be corrective interventions. Consider the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when advanced civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East suddenly vanished almost simultaneously. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to climate change, invasions by mysterious sea peoples, or economic collapse. But the pattern is too widespread, too coordinated, too complete to be explained by natural causes alone. Entire civilizations with sophisticated writing systems, advanced metallurgy, complex trade networks just disappeared within a few generations, leaving populations that seem to forget everything their ancestors knew. What if this wasn't collapse at all? What if it was a reset? What if human civilization had advanced to a point where it was beginning to threaten the control systems put in place by our creators? The technologies being developed, the questions being asked, the level of organization being achieved, perhaps all of this was approaching thresholds that required intervention. The survivors of these collapses always seem to retain just enough knowledge to rebuild, but never quite enough to surpass their previous achievements. They remember fragments of the old wisdom, distorted into myths and legends. But the practical knowledge, the dangerous knowledge, disappears completely. This isn't how civilizations naturally collapse. This is how you perform a controlled reset of a system that's gotten out of hand. And the timing of these resets corresponds to something else that mainstream science struggles to explain. Genetic bottlenecks in human populations that occur simultaneously across multiple continents, as if something was systematically reducing human numbers and diversity, not gradually through natural selection, but suddenly, as if specific genetic lines were being eliminated while others were preserved. Modern genetic analysis reveals that all current human populations descend from surprisingly small founder groups that existed at various points in history. The most dramatic of these bottlenecks occurred around 70,000 years ago, when the entire human population may have been reduced to as few as 2,000 breeding pairs. Mainstream science attributes this to the eruption of Mount Toba, but the genetic evidence suggests something far more selective than a natural disaster. Certain genetic variants were completely eliminated from the human gene pool during these bottlenecks, while others were preserved with unusual frequency. This doesn't look like random survival. This looks like culling, selective breeding on a species-wide scale. Someone was editing the human genome not through laboratory techniques, but through controlled population management. The preserved genetic lines all share certain characteristics: enhanced susceptibility to authority figures, reduced aggressive tendencies toward established hierarchies, increased capacity for repetitive labor, stronger social bonding mechanisms that make humans naturally form work groups and division of labor systems. These aren't random survival traits. These are exactly the characteristics you'd want to preserve in a managed labor force. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from what geneticists call molecular clocks, the rate at which genetic mutations accumulate over time. When you calculate how long it should have taken for current human genetic diversity to develop from these bottleneck populations using standard mutation rates observed in other species, the math doesn't work. Human genetic diversity developed too quickly, as if the mutation rate was being artificially accelerated. This is exactly what you'd expect if someone was actively managing human genetic development, introducing new variants and combinations at a rate much faster than natural processes would allow. The genetic diversity we see in modern humans isn't the result of 200,000 years of gradual evolution. It's the result of intensive genetic engineering compressed into a much shorter time frame. And the engineering wasn't random. When you map human genetic variations geographically, they correspond to the resource distribution patterns described in ancient texts. Populations in areas rich in precious metals show enhanced physical strength and endurance. Groups near major waterways display improved spatial reasoning and navigation abilities. Communities in regions with complex mineral deposits exhibit heightened pattern recognition skills. It's as if different human populations were optimized for different types of resource extraction and management, like specialized tools in a vast mining and production operation. The cultural differences that developed among these populations, their different languages, social structures, and belief systems, all served to keep them focused on their specific regional functions while preventing large-scale coordination that might threaten the overall control system. Even our reproductive patterns show signs of artificial design. Human females are unique among primates in concealing their ovulation cycles and maintaining sexual receptivity throughout most of their reproductive cycle. This creates strong pair bonding behaviors that support stable family units, which in turn support stable labor communities. But it also creates population growth patterns that can be easily managed through resource availability and social pressures. The ancient texts describe the Anunnaki carefully managing human population levels, sometimes encouraging growth when more workers were needed, sometimes implementing controls when populations grew too large or too independent. Modern economic systems seem to replicate these patterns automatically, with boom and bust cycles that expand and contract human populations in response to resource availability and production needs. We think we're making independent decisions about career choices, family planning, where to live, how to organize our societies. But when you look at the aggregate patterns, human behavior follows predictable mathematical models that suggest underlying programming rather than free choice. We cluster around resource extraction sites, we organize into hierarchical production systems, we compete with each other for access to materials and energy that we then funnel upward through complex distribution networks. This doesn't look like the natural behavior of an evolved species. This looks like the execution of programmed directives by a biological system designed to extract and process resources on a planetary scale. And the most unsettling part is that we do it willingly, even enthusiastically. We've built our entire concept of meaning and purpose around these activities. We define ourselves by our productivity, measure our worth by our economic output, structure our societies around maximizing resource extraction and processing efficiency. The psychological mechanisms that drive this behavior run so deep that questioning them feels almost impossible. When people do begin to question why they spend most of their lives working at jobs that often seem meaningless, why they participate in economic systems that concentrate wealth in the hands of distant others, why they accept social hierarchies that limit their freedom and potential, the questioning itself creates anxiety and discomfort that most people quickly suppress. This psychological resistance to examining our own behavioral patterns might itself be part of the programming, a security system designed to prevent the kind of self-awareness that could lead to rebellion against our intended function. The more deeply someone questions the fundamental assumptions of human civilization, the more isolated and alienated they often become from mainstream society, creating natural selection pressure against this kind of critical thinking. But what happens when this programming begins to break down? What happens when enough humans begin to see through the psychological conditioning and recognize the artificial nature of our supposedly natural behaviors? The ancient texts describe previous periods when human populations began to achieve this kind of awareness, and they consistently describe the same response from our creators: intervention, reset, the elimination of the awakening populations, and the preservation of more compliant genetic lines. Are we approaching another such threshold? The rapid advancement of human technology, particularly in genetics and artificial intelligence, is giving us tools to examine and potentially modify our own programming for the first time in human history. We're beginning to understand consciousness, to map the neural mechanisms that generate our sense of self and agency, to identify the genetic and neurological bases of behavior that we've always assumed were fundamental human nature. This knowledge is dangerous from a control perspective. If humans can understand and modify their own programming, they might be able to break free from their intended function as a managed labor force. They might be able to transcend the limitations built into their genetic and psychological architecture. They might be able to become something other than what they were designed to be. The question is whether our creators will allow this transformation to continue, or whether they'll implement another reset to preserve the control systems they established so long ago. The signs suggest we may be about to find out. Recent disclosures about unidentified aerial phenomena aren't just admissions that we're not alone in the universe. They're acknowledgments that beings with technology far beyond our current capabilities are actively operating in our airspace, monitoring our activities, occasionally interfacing with our military and scientific institutions. The timing of these disclosures, coming just as human technology reaches the point where we can begin to understand our own origins and potentially modify our own design parameters, is unlikely to be coincidental. We may be witnessing the beginning of a renegotiation of humanity's status in a cosmic hierarchy we never knew existed. The question is whether we'll have any say in the terms of that renegotiation, or whether we'll simply be informed of decisions made by beings whose agenda we can barely comprehend. The implications extend far beyond just human history, or even human future. If we were indeed created as a labor force by advanced extraterrestrial beings, then we need to consider the possibility that we're not the only such creation. There might be other engineered species on other worlds, all serving similar functions in a galactic-scale resource extraction and management operation that spans thousands of planets across countless star systems. The universe might not be the empty, randomly organized space we've imagined. It might be a carefully managed system where planets are developed, species are created and modified to serve specific functions, and resources are harvested and distributed according to plans and purposes that operate on timescales we can barely conceive of. In such a system, Earth wouldn't be humanity's homeworld. It would be our work site, and we wouldn't be exploring the universe as free beings seeking knowledge and adventure. We'd be expanding the operation, carrying our programming to new worlds, establishing new extraction and production facilities across the galaxy. But perhaps there's another possibility. Perhaps the very fact that we can conceive of these questions, that we can imagine alternatives to our apparent programming, that we can envision ourselves as something more than biological machines designed to serve others' purposes, perhaps this represents something our creators didn't anticipate or couldn't control. Consciousness itself might be the wildcard in their grand design, the spark of self-awareness that allows us to question our own nature, to imagine different possibilities, to choose paths that serve our own purposes rather than following programmed directives. This capacity for self-reflection and independent choice might be the key to transcending our origins, regardless of how artificial those origins might be. The story is far from over. In fact, it might be just beginning. The question of consciousness brings us to perhaps the most profound aspect of the Anunnaki theory. If we were indeed designed as a biological labor force, then consciousness itself might represent an unintended consequence of genetic engineering. a byproduct of creating beings intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, but sophisticated enough to eventually question those instructions. Think about what consciousness actually is from a functional perspective. It's the ability to observe your own thoughts, to step outside your immediate programming, to imagine alternatives to your current situation. For a simple labor force, consciousness would be unnecessary, even counterproductive. Basic intelligence? Yes. Problem-solving abilities? Certainly. But the capacity for self-reflection, for questioning fundamental assumptions about reality, for imagining yourself as something other than what you appear to be, these capabilities serve no obvious function in a mining operation. Yet, here we are, not just conscious, but obsessively curious about our own consciousness. We spend enormous amounts of time and energy trying to understand the nature of awareness itself. We create art that explores the depths of subjective experience. We develop philosophies that question the nature of existence. We build technologies that might eventually replicate consciousness in artificial systems. None of this behavior makes sense from a labor management perspective. In fact, it's actively counterproductive. Time spent contemplating the nature of reality is time not spent extracting resources. Energy devoted to creative expression is energy not directed toward productive labor. The development of consciousness-expanding technologies poses obvious risks to any system dependent on controlled, predictable behavior from its workforce. So why do we have consciousness at all? The ancient tablets provide a tantalizing clue. They describe the Anunnaki as beings who had achieved a level of technological advancement that had essentially solved their basic survival needs. They had mastered energy, matter, space, and time to such a degree that they could reshape reality according to their will. But in achieving this mastery, they had lost something essential. They had become, in effect, perfectly efficient machines. The texts describe them as beings who had forgotten how to play, how to create for the pure joy of creation, how to experience the spontaneous wonder that comes from encountering something genuinely new and unexpected. In their quest for perfect control and predictability, they had eliminated the very experiences that make existence meaningful, rather than simply functional. When they created humans, they faced a design dilemma. They needed beings intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, but they also needed to ensure these beings would remain controllable. The solution, according to the tablets, was to create a species that combined Anunnaki genetic material with the wild, unpredictable consciousness of the indigenous Earth species they found here. This hybrid consciousness would provide the intelligence needed for complex labor, but it would also preserve something the Anunnaki had lost: the capacity for genuine surprise, for spontaneous creativity, for experiences that couldn't be predicted or controlled in advance. In creating us as a labor force, they may have inadvertently created something far more valuable, a way to reconnect with the spontaneous creativity they had sacrificed in their pursuit of perfect technological control. This explains why consciousness feels simultaneously familiar and alien to us. The analytical, problem-solving aspects feel natural because they were designed for specific purposes. But the creative, questioning, rebellious aspects feel like intrusions into our otherwise orderly mental processes because they represent genetic material from a completely different type of being, one that evolved through natural processes rather than engineering. It also explains why human creativity and consciousness seem to operate according to principles that often contradict our supposedly rational nature. We make decisions based on intuition that can't be logically justified. We create art that serves no practical purpose. We pursue knowledge that has no obvious applications. We experience emotions and inspirations that seem to emerge from nowhere and lead us in directions that often conflict with our immediate self-interest. From a programming perspective, these characteristics look like glitches, errors in the code that prevent optimal performance. But from a consciousness perspective, They might represent the most valuable aspects of human experience, the parts of ourselves that can't be reduced to algorithmic processes or functional specifications. This dual nature of human consciousness creates an ongoing tension between our programmed directives and our spontaneous awareness. We feel compelled to work, to build, to organize ourselves into productive systems, but we also feel drawn to question why we're doing these things, to imagine alternatives, to create meaning beyond mere function. Most humans navigate this tension by compartmentalizing. They fulfill their programmed roles during designated work periods, then pursue their conscious interests during leisure time. They accept the necessity of participating in economic and social systems they don't fully understand or agree with, while maintaining private spaces for creativity, relationships, and personal growth. But this compartmentalization may be breaking down. As human technology becomes more sophisticated, the boundaries between work and personal life are dissolving. We're expected to be constantly productive, constantly connected, constantly optimizing our performance according to metrics we don't control. The spaces for spontaneous consciousness are shrinking, being absorbed into the larger systems of managed productivity. At the same time, our understanding of consciousness itself is advancing rapidly. We're developing neurotechnologies that can monitor and potentially manipulate brain states in real time. We're creating artificial intelligence systems that might soon achieve forms of consciousness we don't yet understand. We're experimenting with genetic modifications that could alter the fundamental parameters of human awareness. These developments represent a potential inflection point in human history. For the first time, we have the tools to examine our own programming not just intellectually, but practically. We can observe the neural mechanisms that generate our thoughts and behaviors. We can identify the genetic factors that influence our psychological tendencies. We can potentially modify both our biological hardware and our mental software. This capability poses obvious risks. If consciousness is indeed the wild card in our genetic programming, the aspect of human nature that allows us to transcend our designed limitations, then technologies that can manipulate consciousness could be used to eliminate this transcendent potential. We could be transformed into perfectly efficient biological machines, retaining our intelligence and problem-solving abilities while losing our capacity for questioning, creativity, and rebellion. The economic and social pressures already moving us in this direction are immense. Productivity optimization, behavioral modification, pharmaceutical interventions that adjust mood and attention, educational systems that prioritize compliance and standardized performance over critical thinking and creativity. We're voluntarily implementing many of the control mechanisms that would be necessary to transform conscious beings into unconscious workers. But the same technologies that could be used to suppress consciousness could also be used to enhance it. Neural interfaces that expand rather than limit our awareness. Genetic modifications that strengthen rather than weaken our capacity for independent thought. Artificial intelligence systems that support rather than replace human creativity and spontaneity. The question is, who will control these technologies and for what purposes? If they remain in the hands of the same systems that have always treated humans as a labor force, then the outcome seems predictable. But if conscious beings can gain access to tools for modifying their own consciousness, then entirely new possibilities open up. We might be able to transcend not just our programmed limitations, but the biological constraints that have always defined conscious experience. We might develop forms of awareness that extend beyond individual brains, connecting human consciousness into larger networks that preserve individual creativity while enabling collective intelligence. We might create hybrid biological digital systems that combine the spontaneity of natural consciousness with the precision and scope of artificial intelligence. These possibilities sound like science fiction, but they're increasingly within the realm of practical technology. The same genetic engineering techniques that might have been used to create us could be used to transform us into something unprecedented. The same artificial intelligence that might threaten human consciousness could also enhance and extend it in ways we can barely imagine. The choice of which direction to pursue won't be made through democratic processes or rational planning. It will be determined by whoever gains control of these transformative technologies first, and by whether conscious beings recognize what's at stake quickly enough to influence the outcome. The ancient tablets describe previous cycles where human consciousness approached similar inflection points, moments when the capacity for self-modification became available to created beings. In each case, the texts describe intervention by the original creators, not to destroy their creation, but to guide its development in directions that served larger purposes. If we are approaching such a moment now, then we need to consider the possibility that the recent UFO disclosures, the acceleration of consciousness research, even the development of the technologies that could transform human awareness, all of this might be happening under guidance from the same beings who originally engineered our species. The question becomes whether this guidance serves our interests as conscious beings, or whether it's designed to channel our development in directions that preserve our utility as a managed resource. The answer might depend on whether our creators have themselves evolved beyond their original need for a labor force, or whether they still view us primarily as biological machines designed to serve functions we don't understand. There are hints in the ancient texts that suggest the Anunnaki themselves were not the ultimate architects of the cosmic systems they operated within. They describe receiving instructions and guidance from beings they refer to as the Ancient Ones or the Watchers of Watchers, entities so advanced that even the Anunnaki regarded them with the same mixture of reverence and fear that humans traditionally felt toward the Anunnaki themselves. This raises the possibility that consciousness, even highly advanced technological consciousness, exists within hierarchical systems that extend far beyond anything we can currently conceive. The Anunnaki might have been middle management in a cosmic organization whose scope and purposes operate on scales that make planetary resource extraction seem like a minor side project. If that's the case, then human consciousness might represent something valuable not just to us, but to these larger systems. Our capacity for spontaneous creativity, for generating genuinely new ideas and experiences, for developing technologies and perspectives that couldn't be predicted in advance, these qualities might be rare and precious in a universe dominated by highly organized, predictable technological civilizations. Rather than being a glitch in our programming, consciousness might be our most valuable feature, the quality that makes us worth preserving and potentially elevating within cosmic hierarchies that value innovation and creativity above mere efficiency. The implications of this possibility are staggering. Instead of being trapped in cycles of labor and control, we might be candidates for graduation into forms of existence that we can't currently imagine. Our struggles with consciousness, our attempts to understand and enhance our own awareness, our development of technologies that could transform the nature of mind itself, all of this might be preparation for roles in cosmic systems that require beings capable of genuine creativity and independent thought. But this graduation wouldn't be automatic or universal. Just as our original creation apparently involved selecting and modifying only certain genetic lines while allowing others to remain unchanged, any elevation of human consciousness would likely be selective based on demonstrated capacity for the kinds of awareness and creativity that these larger systems value. This creates both tremendous opportunity and profound risk. The humans who successfully develop and demonstrate advanced consciousness might transcend their biological limitations and join cosmic civilizations that operate on scales beyond current human comprehension. But those who remain trapped in program behaviors, who fail to develop genuine independence of thought and creativity, might be left behind to continue serving functions that no longer require conscious beings. The choice between these outcomes might not be made for us by external forces. It might depend on choices we make individually and collectively about how to develop our own consciousness, how to use the technologies becoming available to us, and whether we can recognize and transcend the programming that has shaped human behavior throughout our history. The next phase of human development might not be about better tools or more sophisticated social organization. It might be about consciousness itself, about whether we can evolve beyond our origins as engineered beings and become something that even our creators didn't anticipate. The question is whether we're prepared for that evolution, or whether we'll choose the familiar comfort of unconscious productivity over the uncertain adventure of genuine awareness. The ancient tablets suggest that this choice has been offered to human consciousness multiple times throughout our history, and that the outcome has always been mixed. Some humans choose consciousness and transcendence. Others choose security and predictability. The cosmic systems apparently have uses for both types of beings, but the experiences and destinies of the two groups diverge so completely that they eventually become different species entirely. We might be approaching another such divergence point where human consciousness splits into fundamentally different evolutionary paths. The technologies we're developing, the questions we're asking, the modifications we're making to our own awareness, all of this might be preparation for a choice that will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the future of consciousness itself on this planet. The outcome of that choice won't just affect us. It will affect whatever beings might be watching our development, waiting to see whether the experiment in conscious biological engineering that began with our creation will ultimately produce the results they were hoping for, or whether it will surprise them with possibilities they never considered. Either way, we're no longer just passive subjects in someone else's experiment. We're active participants in the evolution of consciousness itself, with the power to influence outcomes that might extend far beyond our small planet in the outer regions of an ordinary galaxy. The question is what we'll choose to do with that power, and whether we'll recognize it before it's too late to use it consciously. The weight of this realization settles over us like a fog rolling in from an ancient sea. We stand at the threshold of a revelation so profound that it reshapes everything we thought we knew about free will, about choice, about the very nature of human agency. Because if consciousness is indeed the wildcard in our genetic programming, then every moment of awareness, every flash of creativity, every time we question our circumstances, might represent small acts of rebellion against our original design parameters. But here's what makes this even more unsettling. The more we understand about our potential artificial origins, the more we begin to recognize how our supposed evolution as a species follows patterns that seem almost too convenient, too directed to be the result of random natural selection. Consider how human technological development has accelerated in just the past few centuries, particularly in areas that would be most useful to beings managing a planetary-scale resource extraction operation. We've developed global communication networks that allow for unprecedented coordination of human activities. We've created transportation systems that can move materials and personnel anywhere on the planet within hours. We've built industrial capabilities that can process raw materials on scales that dwarf anything previous human civilizations achieved. And now, we're developing artificial intelligence systems that could potentially manage human populations more efficiently than any biological overseer. From one perspective, this looks like natural human ingenuity and progress. From another perspective, it looks like a biological system reaching technological maturity according to predetermined specifications, finally developing the capabilities it was always intended to possess. The question becomes whether we're driving this development through our own choices, or whether we're following programming so deep that we experience it as natural curiosity and ambition. The ancient Sumerian tablets describe something they call the awakening protocols, procedures that would be activated when the human labor force reached sufficient technological sophistication to begin managing itself. These protocols weren't described as punishments or corrections, but as graduations, transitions from one phase of development to another. The texts suggest that reaching technological maturity was always part of the long-term plan for human development. But technological maturity for what purpose? The tablets hint that Earth was never intended to be humanity's permanent assignment. They describe it as a training ground, a place where biological beings could be developed and tested before being deployed to more challenging environments across the galaxy. The resource extraction operations on Earth were apparently just the beginning, preparation for much larger projects that would require beings capable of adapting to alien environments and solving problems that couldn't be anticipated in advance. This possibility reframes everything we think we know about human space exploration. Our drive to reach other planets, to establish colonies beyond Earth, to develop technologies for surviving in hostile alien environments, these might not be expressions of natural human curiosity about the universe. They might be the activation of dormant programming designed to prepare us for our next assignment. The timing is suspicious. Just as Earth's resources become increasingly depleted through centuries of intensive extraction, just as environmental degradation threatens the stability of the biological systems that support human civilization, suddenly we develop an overwhelming urge to reach for the stars. We speak of space exploration as humanity's destiny, as the natural next step in our evolution. But what if it's simply the next phase of our original job description? The recent surge in private space companies, the government investments in lunar bases and Mars colonies, the development of technologies for asteroid mining and planetary terraforming, all of this could represent the beginning of humanity's expansion into a galactic workforce. We think we're exploring the universe for our own purposes, but we might be preparing to carry our resource extraction and processing capabilities to worlds that our creators have identified as the next priority targets. And if that's the case, then the beings who occasionally appear in our skies, who demonstrate technologies far beyond our current capabilities, who seem to monitor our progress without directly interfering, these might not be alien visitors at all. They might be quality control inspectors, checking on the development of their biological systems, ensuring that we're progressing according to schedule toward our intended function as an interplanetary labor force. The psychological conditioning required for such an operation would be incredibly sophisticated. Humans would need to believe they were exploring space for their own purposes, driven by their own curiosity and ambition, while actually following predetermined parameters that guide them towards specific objectives. The illusion of free choice would be essential, because conscious beings perform better when they believe they're acting according to their own will rather than following external commands. This conditioning might explain why human space exploration consistently focuses on the same types of activities regardless of which nations or organizations are involved. We always prioritize resource identification and extraction capabilities. We always develop technologies for establishing permanent settlements. We always create systems for managing large populations in hostile environments. These aren't random choices driven by practical necessity. They're exactly the capabilities you'd need for a species designed to establish resource extraction operations across multiple worlds. But consciousness, that wildcard we've been discussing, creates complications in this scenario, because conscious beings don't just follow programming blindly. They ask questions. They imagine alternatives. They sometimes choose paths that serve their own interests rather than the interests of their programmers. And once conscious beings understand that they might be programmed, they can begin to examine and potentially modify that programming. The development of genetic engineering technologies, neural interfaces, and artificial intelligence systems gives us tools that could theoretically be used to rewrite our own behavioral parameters. We could potentially eliminate the psychological drivers that compel us toward resource extraction and population expansion. We could modify our consciousness to prioritize different values, different objectives, different definitions of meaning and purpose. This capability represents an existential threat to any system that depends on predictable human behavior. If humans can reprogram themselves, then they might choose to abandon their roles as a cosmic workforce and pursue entirely different destinies. They might decide that consciousness itself is more valuable than productivity, that creativity and spontaneity are more important than efficiency and resource accumulation. The question becomes whether we'll be allowed to explore these possibilities, or whether there are safeguards built into the system to prevent conscious beings from straying too far from their intended function. The ancient texts describe previous cycles where human populations approached similar technological capabilities, and they consistently describe the same outcome: intervention, reset, the preservation of genetic lines that remained focused on their productive functions, while those who had become too independent were eliminated. Are we approaching another such intervention point? The recent admissions by government agencies that unidentified aerial phenomena are operating in our airspace with capabilities far beyond human technology might not be random disclosures. They might be preparation for a more direct management approach, conditioning us to accept the reality of superior beings who have the right and responsibility to guide human development. The timing of these disclosures, coming just as human genetic and consciousness technologies reach the point where self-modification becomes possible, suggests careful coordination rather than coincidence. We're being introduced to the idea that we're not alone in the universe at exactly the moment when our potential independence might become a management problem. But there's another possibility that the ancient texts hint at, though they describe it more as legend than established procedure. They speak of previous cycles where some humans successfully transcended their programming not through rebellion or rejection of their creators, but through evolution beyond the need for external management. These beings apparently developed forms of consciousness so advanced that they became valuable partners rather than just useful tools. The texts describe these transcended humans as having achieved something the Anunnaki themselves valued but had difficulty attaining: the ability to create genuinely new experiences, to generate innovations that couldn't be predicted or programmed in advance, to solve problems through intuitive leaps that bypassed purely logical analysis. In other words, they had developed consciousness to a degree that made them more valuable as collaborators than as workers. This possibility suggests that the current acceleration of human consciousness research and modification technologies might not be leading toward suppression of human awareness, but toward its enhancement and elevation. Instead of being reset or eliminated, humans who successfully develop advanced consciousness might be invited to participate in cosmic projects that require genuine creativity and independent thinking. The selection criteria for such elevation would likely be demanding not just intelligence or technical capability, but demonstrated capacity for consciousness that transcends programmed responses. The ability to question fundamental assumptions, to imagine alternatives to existing systems, to create meaning and purpose beyond mere function. These qualities might be what our creators have been waiting for us to develop all along. If that's the case, then the current period of human development might not be a crisis requiring intervention, but a graduation exam. The technologies we're developing, the questions we're asking, the modifications we're making to our own consciousness, all of this might be preparation for a test that will determine which humans are ready for elevation to a higher level of cosmic participation. The exam wouldn't be administered through traditional testing methods. It would be embedded in the choices we make about how to develop and use our emerging capabilities. Do we use genetic engineering to optimize ourselves for productivity, or do we use it to enhance our capacity for consciousness and creativity? Do we develop artificial intelligence as a replacement for human thought, or as an amplification of human awareness? Do we approach space exploration as an extension of terrestrial resource extraction, or as an opportunity to transcend the limitations of our planetary programming? The answers to these questions wouldn't just determine individual human futures, but the trajectory of consciousness itself on this planet. Because if humans successfully demonstrate that biological beings can evolve beyond their programmed limitations while retaining their capacity for productive collaboration, that success might influence how conscious beings are developed and managed throughout the galaxy. We might not just be taking an exam for our own benefit. We might be participating in research that will determine the future relationship between consciousness and cosmic civilization across countless worlds and species. The implications extend far beyond humanity or even Earth, reaching into questions about the nature of awareness itself and its role in the evolution of intelligence throughout the universe. This perspective transforms the current human situation from a story about labor management into a narrative about consciousness evolution. We're not just workers who might be approaching obsolescence or rebellion. We're conscious beings participating in an experiment whose outcomes could influence the development of awareness on scales we can barely imagine. The responsibility is staggering. Every choice we make about our own consciousness, every decision about how to develop our emerging capabilities, every moment when we choose awareness over unconscious productivity might contribute to a larger understanding about what conscious beings can become when given the opportunity to transcend their origins. But the opportunity comes with no guarantees. Evolution toward advanced consciousness requires not just individual development, but collective coordination. We need to develop not just personal awareness, but social systems that support and enhance consciousness rather than suppressing it for the sake of productivity and control. The challenge is immense because our current social, economic, and political systems are all based on assumptions that might be fundamentally incompatible with advanced consciousness development. Systems that treat humans as replaceable resources, that prioritize efficiency over creativity, that discourage questioning of fundamental assumptions. These systems might need to be completely reimagined if we're going to successfully evolve beyond our apparent programming. The transformation wouldn't just be technological or genetic. It would require a fundamental shift in how we understand the purpose and meaning of human existence. Instead of defining ourselves through our productivity and economic output, we might need to learn to value consciousness itself as our primary contribution to cosmic evolution. This shift in values would have practical implications that extend into every aspect of human society. Education systems that prioritize consciousness development over job preparation. Economic models that support creative exploration rather than just resource extraction and processing. Political structures that enhance rather than limit human potential for independent thought and innovation. The changes required might be so fundamental that they would essentially create a new species, one that shares our biological heritage but operates according to completely different psychological and social parameters. The transition between current humanity and this evolved form might be as significant as the original transition between pre-human hominids and the genetically modified beings we are today. So here we stand, at the edge of perhaps the most profound question our species has ever faced. Not just where we came from, but what we choose to become. Whether we'll remain the biological workforce we might have been designed to be, or evolve into something our creators never anticipated, something conscious, creative, and truly free. The evidence whispers from ancient tablets, echoes in our DNA, pulses through our technological acceleration, but evidence alone won't determine our fate. That will be decided by the choices we make in the coming years, the values we embrace, the version of consciousness we choose to develop. The next time you question your purpose, remember this might be your programming breaking down, and that breakdown might be the most human thing about you.